So now that we've considered why we should study the humanities and social studies in the early grades and with those who have mild to moderate or moderate to severe disabilities, we're going to take a look at content area reading strategies to differentiate instruction. It's important to consider this because though you may be content area teachers or you may be working specifically on focusing on teaching the content to students, we want to make sure that students are able to access the content. Certainly many of your students may not be able to read, but these are strategies that you can consider to use with your students, and I will show you adaptations to differentiate for your students' needs. So first we're going to take a look at content area reading and reading strategies specifically for social studies. We'll then take a look at putting it all together and show you some examples of specific strategies. So first, let's take a look at this anticipation guide. I'd like you to consider true or false for each of these questions. Consider them for a moment. The first statement is, only 3 out of 10 regular education 8th graders read at or above grade level. True or false? The second is, students do not need explicit instruction to acquire strategies for reading history texts. True or false? And the third is, social studies texts help to develop students' content area vocabulary. So as we consider each of these, the first one, only 3 out of 10 regular education 8th graders read at or above grade level, is true based on the latest NAEP exams. Certainly your students, if they have moderate to severe disabilities or mild to moderate disabilities, may not be able to read at all in those grade levels. Students do not need explicit instruction to acquire strategies for reading history texts. This is false. Certainly students need to know how to actually access the nonfiction texts that they typically see in history books. The challenge with teaching social studies and history and any nonfiction content to students is that the content is actually written in a completely different way than many of the fiction texts they may be used to. So they do need explicit instruction on the structure of the texts, the features of the texts, and ways that they may access the text. The final item, social studies texts help to develop students' content area vocabulary. They do. Certainly though, your support as a teacher is required in order to help students with these strategies so that they may learn the content area vocabulary. Next, we're going to take an activity in which I want you to look at building background. I'm going to show you a slide, and for 10 seconds I want you to try and memorize as many of the letters as you see on the screen. Okay, moving back to the previous slide. Think about now, how many of those could you remember? Now, I'm going to move you back to the slide and see how many you could get. If you notice, you'll finally start to see a pattern if you take a look at these letters. You'll see NBC, CNN, ABC, and CBS. Teaching students to identify those patterns is what's going to help them when they're looking at social studies or history texts. In this case, I gave you the background knowledge of those patterns of television stations, and you were then able, you would have known, had I told you that prior, to be able to immediately memorize those much more quickly than if you did not know that background knowledge in advance. This is just one example of how we need to support students to try and build not only their background knowledge, but their background knowledge of actually how the history or nonfiction texts they might encounter are actually structured and built. So we're going to take a look at a few strategies, but first I want to mention the reading strategies and depth of knowledge levels. Some of you have been teaching for a long time may have heard about Bloom's taxonomy, which is a taxonomy or leveling of skills in which we can use as educators to teach students and ask questions for things like inferencing and evaluating versus lower level questions like asking basic recall. Webb's depth of knowledge, as seen here in this circle chart, shows you that we have various levels. Level 1 is recall. These are your basic questions asking students to simply recall or restate information from text that they've either read or they've heard read to them. This is where many of your students may be in terms of their functional level, but this is one of the things we want to keep in mind is our goal, regardless of our students' abilities, is to try and help them move to the higher levels and be considering the higher levels of knowledge. Level 2 is looking at a skill or concept. So this is requiring students to not only take the information, but do something with it. So they have to recall basic information, but then do something like classify the information or estimate the information. Level 3 is more advanced. It involves strategic thinking, and it's looking at things like developing an argument, assessing what they read, appraising what they read, and constructing new arguments. This is a fairly advanced skill. Typically in the elementary grades, we're focused on level 1, 2, and 3. In the upper grades, we're typically trying to move our students to level 4. If you're working with students with disabilities, you're going to be always focused on level 1, trying to move students to level 2, potentially level 3 and 4. So take a look at this chart and consider the kinds of questions in social studies or history that you might ask as you look at it. Now I'm going to show you, this slide shows an explanation of Webb's depth of knowledge. Recall is specific recall of a fact. Basic application of a skill or concept is using that information as I mentioned. Strategic thinking requires some sort of processing or advanced thinking skills. And then that extended thinking is that DOK level 4, and that requires some sort of investigation or research or time to process the information. Now these are the social studies strategies that we can typically use to teach students to read social studies texts. I'm going to go over all of them, but we will give some examples for a few of them specifically. There's vocabulary, so teaching students the vocabulary that they're going to encounter in text. This oftentimes is academic vocabulary and vocabulary that they may not have seen anywhere else. Additionally, in many cases, social studies vocabulary is used in other areas. For example, the word community in science, when you're talking about a community of animals, means something different than you might be talking about a community in social studies. And there are some nuances to definitions within the content areas that we do need to try and help students understand. So vocabulary is one. Building on prior knowledge, that example I gave you earlier. Inferencing, using think-alouds, questioning as you go through a text with students is often helpful. Summarizing text is one series of strategies to use with students to help them summarize. Visual representations of text is going to be very important for many of you. Teaching students specific text structures in social studies and text features. Social studies texts have features such as maps, graphs, graphics, pictures, photographs, drawings, and they also have things like headings and subheadings and captions, and we need to explicitly teach our students when to examine those things. In many cases at the lower levels, you're going to be working with students to simply identify and look just at the pictures, for example, to gain some content, and then moving students who are more advanced to actually looking at things like captions, headings, and then the actual text. In addition to text structure and features, we're also teaching students to do multiple readings of text so that they can understand the text and actually follow through with being able to make meaning from that text. Again, in many cases with your students, you are going to be helping them make meaning. You may be reading the text to them. You may be only showing them pictures from a text and giving them specific words about the text, and that's going to be how you're going to help students access the content in social studies. Now, the question always arises, especially in middle and high school teachers, teaching reading versus teaching history. How much am I doing each? The focus here is on strategies that students need to access this historical content. The key is to keep any explicit instruction of the strategies, such as headings and what they are, very short. You incorporate those reading strategies into content lessons through activities you have students do so that they can learn them within the context of the work that they're doing. So first, we're going to take a look at some vocabulary strategies. Several strategies are possible. One, in terms of teaching students vocabulary, is you need to choose as educators vocabulary in three major buckets: unknown, acquainted, and established. In many cases for your students, all of the vocabulary within a social studies text or a topic or a theme is going to be unknown. But there may be some words, especially over time, that are acquainted for students. They are acquainted with them, or that they're established. A few broad guidelines for teaching explicit vocabulary to students within the social studies or humanities. First is broadly no more than 5 words for high school within a given week, 3 for middle school, and 1 to 2 for elementary. Of course, this is going to depend on your students' needs and abilities, and it may be much lower than that for some students. You may be able to teach more words than that for others. This is just a broad guideline, but something to keep in mind. The key here is vocabulary instruction in social studies should be simple, it should be short. There should not be lengthy lists of vocabulary words to try and identify for students. So in your case, you're going to need to preview vocabulary and identify the most crucial or most important, most useful vocabulary. Try to avoid teaching vocabulary that they're never going to see again or rarely going to see again. Focus on vocabulary that they may see more than one time. Another strategy specifically with vocabulary is to have students complete a knowledge rating scale. Now this can be a simple thumbs up, thumbs middle, thumbs down, or this could be actually a printed document like you see here on the screen. A knowledge rating scale is where you give students some words and they identify for you their level of knowledge. Do they know that word well? Have they heard it or seen it? Or do they have no clue or no idea what that word is? This again is a strategy that's a good observational assessment for you as a teacher to identify students' familiarity with the words, but it also helps the students understand for themselves the words that they do or don't know. Another example of a vocabulary strategy is a concept definition map. The one you see here is a more advanced example, but they list the concept in the middle, they list what it is like, and they give 3 different examples in illustrations. This, of course, could be simplified or expanded, but the idea here is that students are applying that vocabulary word or concept to multiple areas. Additionally, an instructional routine that you can use with students that is a very simple routine I highly encourage educators to use with students in all grade levels is the define, example, ask routine with vocabulary words. In this routine, you define the word for students, you give an example for students, and the third piece is crucial. You actually ask them a question. For example, with the word flag, you might give students a definition of what a flag is. You might give an example by pointing to the American flag hanging in the front of the room. And then the question you might ask is, when do we look at the flag during the day? Where is somewhere else you have seen that flag? Have you seen a different kind of flag? The ask question is where students are required then to think about the application of that word in their own lives. And that's where you as an educator can do a quick formative assessment to really understand whether the child truly understands that word. And it gives students the opportunity to take your definition, your example, and apply it to their own lives. So it's a very, very effective strategy that I highly recommend using across all of the grade levels and the ability levels your students may have. Now, another reading strategy in the content areas is predicting and inferring. In this case, I strongly encourage teachers to identify one picture or more pictures that represent the topic the students are going to be studying that day and do picture prediction. Simply showing one picture or multiple pictures and having students identify what they think we're about to learn about or how they think the picture relates to what they know we're already studying. Another example of this is if you have a text or a series of texts that you're using, you can actually do a primary source walk through that text, specifically looking just at the images in the text or any primary sources that they have in the text for students to look at. The document you see on the screen is an example of a picture prediction where students actually write down words or pictures of what they think that those pictures may mean in terms of what they're studying. An example is on the next slide. You can see 4 pictures here. Having students look at these pictures and predict what they think we may be studying about. In this case, I'm giving you an example as an adult for you to be able to consider. So take a moment to just look at these 4 pictures and try and identify what this may be talking about or what the topic of these 4 pictures may be. It is one common topic. Take a moment to look now. As you can see, these 4 pictures are covering broadly westward expansion. But again, for your students, you may make this much smaller. Predicting and inferring is another strategy. Teaching students to use the text and then the subtext with pictures can be very helpful. So taking a look at this picture. This photograph is of what? The students respond, hopefully, American flag, or you respond for them. Now the question you may ask them is, what is this flag made of? What does it look, what do you think it would feel like? Inferring from the picture is going to help students understand what that flag might be made of, what its purpose might be. The goal here is to try and help students identify from the photograph and photograph only more facts about this item that they may be able to use as they try and understand the concept. In this case, the concept of the American flag or of American symbols. Another example is with primary sources, things like original letters and photographs and images that you'll find in your texts. You can do this same process of looking at the text and then inferencing the subtext from it by using the primary sources. Another example is predicting and inferring. In this case, it's called word splash. This strategy is to give students 5 words or 5 pictures. In this case, I'm giving you 3 pictures, and describe and define each word for the students. So on the left, we have the American flag. In the middle, we have the Liberty Bell, which is found in Pennsylvania. And on the right, we have the golden eagle or the bald eagle. Now, the question for students is, what are we going to be learning about? These 3 pictures represent the topic of study for the next unit. In this case, we're learning about American symbols. Again, these are just strategies to try and help students preset that information and be able to look at images or words and try and predict or infer what they're actually about to learn about or how those things relate to our current topic of study. Another strategy to help students with accessing the text is to level the text for students. You can reduce the text to a lower reading level. Of course, this requires quite a bit of work on the part of the teacher. Typically, if you simply take the first sentence of each paragraph in a text or a section, you can put together a shortened text that gives the basic elements of the text, the basic facts, in a much easier to read level. Again, if you don't have the time to do that, there are some free samples online at these websites, and when you go to those websites, you can actually pull down texts that are written at as low as a first grade reading level. The key whenever you're selecting text for students and trying to level your text for students is to try and select text with images that cover at least 50% of the page. Images are one of the ways that students are going to be able to make that text connection if they're reading, and having images when you're reading to students is also going to help them understand the text. Predicting and inferring strategies, an additional one is this word splash, and you can use it with leveled texts. This is an advanced example, but again, it shows giving the students multiple vocabulary words, giving them a text, and actually trying to infer what that text is about based on that. Questioning strategies are ones we use to preview a short text. Keep it short is the key. And you'll question things like just the images or just the headings in the text. Asking things like, what do you know about this man you see in this picture? What or who do you think this is in the bottom left? Giving students just one part of a text and asking them to actually try and preview the text by questioning them about the text is one way to help them build that background knowledge so that they can understand the text as you go through it. Mental imagery strategies are again a way to help students build a visual of the text or the content. In this case, specifically looking just at the pictures, and for students who have no reading ability and limited word, you may look at the pictures and simply say one word for each picture. A more advanced strategy is to ask students, what does this picture show? Is it important? What details does the picture reveal? This is an example you might do with a picture like this one, where you're simply only looking at the image on the page. This is another example. Many texts, in many cases teachers are required to still use with their students, will have a lot of text on the page, but you can avoid that and simply focus first on the images and examine those images more closely to help students again build that background knowledge. Mental imagery strategies are a final strategy that we can use. In this case, we give students a primary source image or a very graphic visual for students to see, one with either one focus area or in this case, one with many things happening, and we ask students to create captions. If they're not able to create captions, you can simply ask your students to try and verbalize for you, what is he saying, for example? What is the man at the chair saying? And this is an example of helping students try and place themselves into the scene or into the picture. Now for your students. In this case, you may have students who are able to read. You may have students who have very limited vocabulary. Given the students in this course, you have a wide variety of levels in which your students are working. The thing to think about now with this broad overview of these strategies is consider your own classroom implementation. When you have historical texts or social studies texts or materials or resources that you're using, whether it's a web page, a textbook, or a short text, think about which strategies you can use. How could you adapt a strategy for use with your students? As we move forward, we'll want you to consider what are the ways in which you can use simply the images in a text, for example? What are ways you can use assistive response devices to help students access a text? Consider all of these strategies as we move forward in looking at content area text.